So, every once in a while, Christians come up with lists of what they call questions for atheists. Now, I usually ignore these on the grounds that they're a bunch of borderline passive-aggressive nonsense that's laden with insinuations and that nobody's really looking for answers to anyway. But while I don't feel any compulsion to answer the stupid things, critiquing them every once in a while can be a useful or at least fun way to blow through several misconceptions of atheism. So today I present you not 10, not 20, but a nice round concise 36 questions for atheists, read by Andy Fellows. Before we get started, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe and all that stuff, both to me and to Andy. I know you know how YouTube works, but I guess the little robots who listen in and decide when to recommend your videos like when you say stuff like that, so whatever. That out of the way, here are the 36 questions for atheists.
Number 1. Why is there something rather than nothing?
This is just an absurd question on every conceivable level. Even setting aside the idea of whether there being nothing even makes sense, how do you just walk up and ask a person to explain why everything exists?
Do you believe in God? No. Well, then explain the entire universe, idiot.
This doesn't follow and is totally unrealistic. Besides, unless Christians give an informed answer to why is there God rather than no God, then all they've done is kick the problem in a new territory and pretend it went away. So congratulations on achieving that.
Number 2. Is there any evidence that suggests the universe is eternal?
As with question 1, I'll ask why we should have to answer this question just because we don't believe in their God. I mean, what scientist, much less person on the street, should be expected to know this kind of thing? Besides, you could just as easily ask, is there any evidence that suggests God is eternal? Or, exists?
Number 3. If not, why do atheists hold on to the idea and say you have debunked the Kalam Cosmological Argument?
Aggressively loaded question and switches from third to second person halfway through, but whatever. Honestly, the Kalam is so uncompelling it doesn't even need to be debunked. It's poorly constructed and relies so much on simplified intuition that it's practically meaningless. But even if we generously granted every assumption it makes, all it does is suggest that cause and effect as we perceive it can't go back infinitely, and thus something about the universe must defy our intuition if you think back far enough. That's it. Christians just tack God onto the end for the sole reason that they wanna.
Number 4. If so, why do the vast majority of scientists reject this idea?
If you're implying that most scientists reject the idea of an infinitely regressive steady-state universe, I guess I can go along with that. But God isn't a necessary or even plausible alternative. And honestly, if you're a Christian, or at least fundamentalist, you might want to reconsider bringing what do the vast majority of scientists think into a conversation.
Number 5. Why is the universe so fine-tuned?
Well, it's not, but that's a long story. But unless you can explain why God is fine-tuned for conscious thought, much less infinite wisdom, then again, all you've done is kick the same problem up a level and then ignored it. If you expect us to answer questions and then use special pleading to wiggle out of them yourself, there's no reason to take you seriously.
Number 6. If your answer is the multiverse, why is there no evidence for that theory?
If your answer is God, then why is there no evidence for that theory? Funny how selective your interest in evidence is. But here's the thing. I don't give a flying f*** about the multiverse, nor should I have to. If you want to react to the universe's mysteries by guessing that God did it, nothing compels me to come back with, well, maybe it's the multiverse instead, just so I have my own alternative guess. Instead, I should say, hey, I don't know and neither do you, so stop guessing until you have an informed answer. And suggesting anything else shows you just don't understand atheism.
Number 7. Is it possible that there is no natural explanation for the origin of life?
A few thousand years ago, people might have thought it was possible there was no natural explanation for lightning or the rising and setting of the sun. And while this sounds silly in hindsight, I guess there always might be a far-fetched, precedent-breaking possibility that there's no natural explanation for the next thing we don't fully understand. But by appealing to this possibility, all this question is doing is asking, hey, since we don't know everything, can I interest you in a God of the Gaps argument? Nope.
Number 8. Where does consciousness come from?
It's a function of our brains, and going too much deeper into it would take a while. But again, why are you demanding these answers from me? Why do I have to fully explain complex scientific phenomena I'm not an expert in before you feel I'm justified not defaulting to your magic answer that you can't explain at all? Because can you explain where consciousness comes from, including God's consciousness? If not, you have no real answer and are just declaring that consciousness comes from more consciousness, which... Okay then.
Number 9. Do you lack a belief that God exists, or would you say that God does not exist?
If I were forced to choose between these two, I would say I lack belief that God exists. However, given most supernatural propositions, say, do vampires exist or does the Dark Lord Sauron exist, most of us treat both answers as pretty interchangeable. And people who split hairs between lacking belief and thus dismissing something as not worth your time, which they see as a perfectly adequate response to vampires, and conclusively showing you've disproven it, are expecting you to parse out the nature of your disbelief in way too much detail when instead they should be, proving it.
Number 10. Do you lack a belief that Zeus exists, or do you believe that Zeus does not exist?
My answer for this one is basically the same as for the previous one, so next.
Number 11. If you just lack a belief that Zeus exists, why are you centuries behind the rest of the world who say that Zeus doesn't exist?
Wow, what a fun string of questions based on wordplay. Really, this one just backfires by highlighting the fact that the only difference between Zeus belief and Yahweh belief is people are comfortable saying Zeus does not exist because a bunch of entitled Zeus followers won't nitpick over the certainty of their non-belief until they refine their answer down to, fine, I just lack belief. So nice job. You just illustrated how your religion bullies everybody else into describing their disbelief in your thing differently than their disbelief in other things.
Number 12. Do you act according to what you believe, or what you just lack a belief in?
For the most part, what I believe. I believe there are people around me, and I believe my actions have consequences for me and those people, so I act accordingly. The fact that I don't add a God to the list of things I believe in does not mean I act according to non-belief.
Number 13. What evidence is there that atheism corresponds with reality?
What evidence is there that your lack of belief in vampires corresponds with reality? Your question is just as poorly framed and dumb as this one for all the same reasons.
Number 14. Is atheism a worldview?
No, not everybody's perspective revolves around whether or not they believe your thing. Atheism just seems like a worldview because we live in a highly fundamentalist culture that's always flirting with theocracy and thus have to react to you out of necessity.
Number 15. If not, what is your worldview?
This, like where does consciousness come from and how do you explain all of science, is a big question I don't have time for here. I don't feel obligated to explain my entire outlook on life just to account for saying no to belief in your thing.
Number 16. What would convince you that God exists?
What would convince you that he does not? What would convince you that vampires exist? What would it take for me to sell you this car? Instead of asking dumb questions like this, you should either do the work of convincing me or come to peace with my disbelief. It's not my job to design your strategy for convincing me.
Number 17. Are you willing to follow the evidence, even if it leads to a different understanding of how the universe works?
I'm in a constant state of doing this. Science does it by definition. Religions are the only ones with an avowed practice of not doing so I call BS on this insinuated projection.
Number 18. If Jesus rose from the dead, would you become a Christian?
No, I would just be curious why a person rose from the dead. But let's reverse this one. If someone outside Christianity rose from the dead, would you become a member of their religion? I bet you would not. And the fact that you wouldn't, yet you still ask this question, tells us practically everything we need to know about these questions and where you're coming from with them.
Number 19. If you wouldn't become a Christian, why would you ever accept that he rose from the dead?
Because I saw evidence he rose from the dead? I feel like this question is trying to make some kind of point, but just doing a really bad job of it.
Number 20. Why do atheists keep insisting faith is blind trust, when that's not what Christians or the Bible say?
Ignoring the broad strokes this question paints us with, and its general attitude, I personally think the word faith can mean many different things. The relevant point is that, while individual Christians can define faith however they want, belief in an undemonstrated God does require what we would call blind faith, and the Bible does extol belief without evidence. These are just facts, and pointing them out is not the same as insisting on the broad definition of the word faith.
Number 21. Why do you want material evidence for an immaterial God?
I'd settle for any evidence for God, and I see this question for the dodge that it is. Next.
Number 22. Is there a purpose to life?
We have many purposes for doing things, and strangely none of them depend on the mere existence of a bigger, smarter being until we're grasping for apologetics. Even within Christian doctrine, the real purpose behind what we do involves how our actions affect ourselves and others. So imagine acting with the same motivation just without God being one of the others, and whammo blammo, you understand an atheistic sense of purpose.
Number 23. If there is, by what standard do you determine life has purpose?
Huge question, and I already answered as well as I feel compelled. But reversing this, by what standard do you determine your purpose should revolve around another bigger, stronger, smarter being?
Number 24. If not, what is the point of listening to this video?
It's not a video, it's just a list, which is why my friend Andy had to do the work of reading it for you. Also, I think there is a purpose to life, so next.
Number 25. Where does morality come from?
Morality is not a thing. It's an abstract concept and as such doesn't come from anywhere, so this question is so poorly framed it's useless. One thing I will say is that thinking God magicked morality into existence makes your understanding of it shallower, not deeper.
Number 26. How do you determine what is right and what is wrong?
I evaluate the impact of my actions on others. Christians do this too. It's just that many of them have a poor understanding of why they do it, so they kick the question up to God, sometimes because it's complicated, and sometimes because they need an apologetic strategy.
Number 27. When a lion kills a cub from another pride, because that's what natural selection has raised it to do, is that morally acceptable?
When Joshua killed a Canaanite baby because that's what God told him to do, was that morally acceptable? You'll probably say yes, but you'll add lots of qualifiers meant to explain why it's not broadly acceptable for most people to do and why you wouldn't do it. And whether or not you've put enough thought into why, my reasons for not imitating the lion are pretty much the same as your reasons for not imitating Joshua.
Number 28. If evolution has put a sense of morality into us to help us survive, what makes our actions any better than any other animal's actions?
Well, first off, this question is phrased like but setting that aside, if God put a sense of morality into us and also did the same for Joshua, what makes you deep down see Joshua's actions as fundamentally and vitally different from yours, even though he was acting on God's commands? Honestly think through that for a bit, and you'll understand why I prefer my actions to those of animals.
Number 29. Is it morally acceptable for you to kill a toddler because you can no longer financially support it?
Is it morally acceptable for you to kill a toddler because God wanted you to completely destroy a city? Well, consider why, and I think I've made this point by now.
And number 30. Is it morally acceptable to kill a fetus in the womb because you couldn't financially support it?
Why is this question on your list? The only reason it has anything to do with atheism is that I give serious thought to when consciousness develops in the womb, whereas you think God magicked a soul into existence the moment the sperm hit the egg. Is this really a difference between us you want to highlight?
Number 31. Is it morally acceptable to kill a baby after it has been born?
For me, the answer is no. For you, the answer depends on whether the baby is, for example, a Canaanite or Amalekite. Sorry, but that's the answer your string of leading questions deserves.
Number 32. How can you morally differentiate between a baby in the womb at 6 months and a baby born prematurely at 6 months?
I personally don't, except insofar as we take into account whether a person should have to use their body to keep another person alive.
Number 33. Who was Jesus?
If I asked you who was Achilles, you'd describe him as a literary character. And if you expect me to do more with Jesus, you're approaching this conversation with far too great a sense of entitlement.
Number 34. Why did his disciples die, saying that he rose from the dead?
This is a malformed question. You should instead ask, why does Christian literature say his disciples died saying he rose from the dead? I don't need to explain what a book says people did. I mean, why would the hobbits take the ring into Mordor if Sauron didn't exist, am I right?
Number 35. Why does the Bible keep lining up with archaeology?
Oh, you mean how we have no sign of the millions of Israelites that the Bible says wandered the desert with Moses? Or how no major ancient civilization as much as noticed Noah's flood? Or how the Bible shows the first humans having knowledge of agriculture and animal domestication, even though we know these skills were developed over thousands of years? Those signs? Or were you just talking about the normal, fully expected indications that the Bible writers lived in the real world and made references to real places?
Number 36. Why do the 3 bloodiest regimes in history, Mao's China, Nazi Germany, and Stalin's Russia, come from atheistic ideas?
All right, this one. Fun. Okay, first, to whatever extent these were the bloodiest regimes, it's only because their populations, technology, and infrastructure gave them the ability to round up and kill more people than the religious regimes of the past. I mean, Joshua didn't slay fewer people because he was nicer. He stopped because he finished killing them all. You know, like God told him to. Second, if I told you that the Crusades or Inquisitions or witch trials came from Christian ideas, you'd trip over yourself explaining why the actors behind these events were operating on something other than Christian ideas, demonstrating a remarkable understanding of the fact that, humans being humans, they act on their personal fear, greed, and desire for power in a way that can't be neatly ascribed to a single label they identify with. Yet somehow, the moment we start talking about any regime that was both murderous and irreligious, you suddenly become content to blurt out that they just did it because they're atheists. I mean, come on. You might as well just turn your hypocrisy into a flag and march around flying it wherever you go. And finally, the Nazis weren't atheists. Jiminy Christmas. This program was made possible by a grant from S.R. Foxley, Bob Generic, Nemoris, Connor Emsley, Susan Schindler-Loreto, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.